What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? Someone I was seeing drove me home after a date. On the way he said he wanted to show me something. I was clear I just wanted to go home, but he wouldn't listen and shouted at me. He drove me to a reservoir in the dark and was trying to make me go for a walk. I was in a foreign country, barely knew anyone, and my housemates were away. I genuinely thought he was going to do something awful. Thankfully there was another car there. Strangers who'd been walking their dog gave me a lift home. Late to work. Speeding through this one road that can only be described as two large hills with a little dip in between them. Utility pickup truck is parked on the right shoulder, facing with traffic, in the dip which cannot be seen until you get over the first hill. At the exact wrong moment, utility guy bangs a U-turn without looking behind him, and even if he had, I had just crested the hill and he might not have seen me. When I tell you time slowed, and I could count the individual whiskers on the dude's face, and see him in slow motion saying phew. I'm not lying. Swerved left of center into the oncoming lane to avoid a collision, with no idea if a car would smash head on into me. Missed his truck by inches. Thankfully, no other cars. We both drove away unscathed. I got to work and just sort of sat there shocked, wondering if I already died and was in hell now. This one time someone was determined to run me and my mom over with their vehicle. This was back when I was a teenager and we'd often walk our dogs at night around our neighborhood. It was all pretty well lit, even most of the alleyways we took by backyard porch lights and such. We did this almost every night, a good few blocks to the mini green space and back. While standing on said green space, letting the dogs sniff off leash as we chatted, I kept looking towards the main road that leads into the suburbs, just getting a weird feeling. Then I see a large car coming down the road and it just looked odd. Not helping my weirded out feeling, took a hot second to figure out why. The car is driving on the wrong side of the road. I'm just about to mention it to my mum when apparently the driver sees us too. And he floors it. Tires screeching and everything. I yell to run and fumble to grab a dog by the collar. My mom is taking way too long to realize what's happening, making me panic more as the driver bounces up onto the curb. Then their back tire gets caught on the pole of a metal sign and it is wild to see a car buck upwards as it's yanked sideways by the mangled sign. I still stand on the belief that that sign saved our lives. It gave us a window of time to snap out of our shock, grab at the dogs and make a run into the alley entrance. I didn't look back as we ran, but I heard their engine and the wheels working to get loose and it was terrifying. It's also amazing how your brain just opens up in those panic moments. My mind was all over the place and going through our options quickly. Popping into my brain, I remember that one of the neighbors always leaves their fence gate open. A problem that always led to us trying to quietly get our dogs back from exploring their backyard some nights. Sure enough, that gate is wide open and we hide crouched down in their yard. Just by 2 seconds of closing the gate, there are headlights lighting up the alleyway as the car slows into it. It passes by us and comes around twice again as he looped the neighborhood looking for us. We sat in these people's yard for ages until we couldn't hear the motor anymore. I don't know if the driver was drunk or something, but it was scary having someone use their vehicle as a weapon and try to mow you down like you're 20 points in a video game. My wife was going for minor surgery on her septum, not the first time she'd had to get it, but I was going to stay with her as it was short, and her brother was going to pick us up from recovery that afternoon. 45 minutes later and the doctor coming to tell me her heart had stopped. Twice. They were stopping the surgery until they stabilized her, but they needed to tell me in case I needed to call her family. So there I am, my wife, face open on a table, heart unstable, scared shitless that her son, at home, is going to grow up without a mother and I have no idea what I'm going to do without her. There was a solid hour of complete and utter panic. The doctor actually brought me a minor sedative because he thought I was going to have another heart attack. It was the longest, most grueling 3 hours of my life, running every single scenario through my head and praying to whoever the fuck is going to listen not to let her go. 17 years I waited to marry this woman. We were going to have a family. We were just barely about to start our lives together and she was going to be ripped away from us. Her son. Me. Her family. I would much rather have a heart attack, get stabbed and hit by a car all over again all at once if it meant she was going to be okay. She's currently sitting next to me eating pad thai, complaining about her mother again, and I wouldn't change a single thing. When I was a child, around 12 or 13 years old, I was cycling to the shop one day when a man approached me and asked me for some help. I agreed and he led me around the back of a row of houses, completely out of view of anybody passing by. I immediately felt apprehensive about the situation and I asked him what he needed help with and he asked how do we get back out of here? To which, very confused, I replied the same way we came in. He was acting very shifty and looked like he was contemplating his next move while I was slowly backing away. He then asked me if I would like to see his penis. I got back on my bicycle and cycled away from that creep as fast as I could. I got stalked in college. I told my best friend and she didn't think anything. Well, she texted and told me to come to the dining hall and that there was someone here. It turned out to be a girl from the soccer team. She told us that the guy who'd been stalking me also did a bunch of creepy stuff to the girls' soccer team. Turns out he had a restraining, or protective order, against the entire girls' soccer team. I got carjacked by 3 gangbangers in a remote area. They stuck a shotgun to my face, pistol to the face. They turned me around and put me in an execution-like stance. I remember looking at the ground thinking, I wonder if I'll live long enough to see my own blood hit the ground? For some reason they did not shoot me. When they drove off in my car, I stooped down to pick up my hat. Problem was, I couldn't find my hands or arms. I was so scared, they were still stuck in the air. Rigid. I had to consciously will them down, it was the damnedest thing. Despite the fact that I was then a base jumper and skydiver, this carjacking remains the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. It gave me PTSD that lasted years. A very telling moment came a few years later when I retold this story to my new girlfriend. I casually described the carjackers as the guys who robbed me that day. She stopped me and said, "Did you hear what you just said?" I said yes. I said the guys who robbed me that day. She said no, you said the guys who killed you that day. Apparently I had been saying that quite often and not knowing I was saying that. She was a psychologist and helped me work through some of my lingering PTSD issues. To this day I still have occasional nightmares that I'm being shot down in the street. A dude broke in through an adjoining attic crawl to try to steal medication from our medicine cabinet. I was very fucking pregnant at the time, full walrus stage at this point, and thought it was actually my, now, ex-husband coming home TK shower after work. He worked swing shifts and would often come home when I was in a sleepy daze and I thought nothing of it. When my husband did come home hours later and kissed me and said, "Honey, I'm home," I freaked the fuck out cause I thought he was home. Thankfully nobody was hurt, but it was shitty. When a fire broke out in my house. The whole ordeal is a bit blurry, but from what I can remember I went about my day as usual and at around 4 p.m. I decided to make myself something to eat. After I ate I got sleepy so went for a nap. I'd like to say I woke up about an hour or two later, but I didn't exactly check the time. I woke up to the smell of gas and I couldn't figure out why, so I went through the whole house, following the scent as it grew stronger till I stumbled upon the gas stove which I hadn't switched off. I remember turning it off and opening up all windows and doors immediately afterwards. When it came time to actually go to sleep that night, I went to light a candle in my room. My kitchen is in my basement and my room is on the 3rd story, so I thought nothing of the gas from earlier because I had the windows open. It's a tad blurry from here onwards, but what I can remember is waking up to the beeping of my fire alarm and a loud burning noise and smell, as well as smoke. I remember being able to call 911 at around 2 a.m. before passing out. I woke up in the hospital with the majority of my body being covered in 3rd-degree burns and no recollection of how I got there. To my surprise, which for some reason I hadn't even noticed, I seemed to be 3 fingers and a whole right foot down. Yes, they were amputated. I am aware it was my fault and I'm just glad no one else in the surrounding area was hurt. The fire itself didn't scare me much, I'd say, but it was one heck of an experience. But what really scared me and still does is that I have absolutely no memory from the point where I passed out till the moment I woke up nearly 2 days later. That's what scared me most. Despite this experience, what I do now is laugh about my lack of limbs and come to terms with the fact that since that night I have been very, very unlucky in life. I mean very. Home invasion. I was about 10 yo and having a sleepover at my friend. We were alone at home with her 16 yo big sister when some guys forced their way into the house and started thrashing the place. They drunk the liquor cabinet, burnt cigarettes holes in the walls and furnitures, and fucked on the sofa while the 3 of us were locked up in the bathroom. They left shortly before the parents returned. Then police came, etc. It was so surreal it felt like an out-of-body experience. I felt the fear afterwards for some bizarre reasons. I know the guys got arrested but don't know the details. I was mountain biking down a trail and started hearing bullets whiz past me and hit trees around me. I'd never been shot at before, I was just a teen, and even then I knew what was happening immediately. I dropped to the ground and dragged my bike until it stopped. Biked down the mountain and some rednecks were just shooting off into the woods without a care in the world. Unaware or didn't care, they were shooting in the direction of a trail. I was scared of them, so I didn't say anything. I was like 15. I had been having pain and weakness in my legs. Doctor blew me off over and over as it got worse and worse. Finally convinced her to order an MRI. The day before the MRI is scheduled, I'm at work. We had been thinking I had MS or something, so my boss came over to talk to me about what I was working on, etc. She sits in a chair next to my desk. I turned my head to look at her and pop. Couldn't feel my right leg. Left was pretty numb. I was in shock and I don't think she fully understood what had just happened because I drove myself home. Do not do this. My narcissist ex insisted on making and eating a sandwich before bringing me to the ER. The disc at C45 popped. It crushed and twisted my spinal cord. Your spinal cord doesn't heal once it has been damaged. The bruise left behind is permanent, myelopathy. Had the disc removed, replace the disc space with a piece of some dead guy's femur, thank you anonymous donor, and a plate. After extensive PT and an implanted medical device, I am still disabled and partially paralyzed, but I walk with a forearm crutch. I drive. I live a normal life. The trauma and stress triggered fibromyalgia, and I have a multitude of other health problems. I was already chronically ill when this happened. The most scared I've ever been in my life was probably when I was in the ER, paralyzed from the waist down, not knowing why I was paralyzed or if I'd ever walk again. This is tied with my younger child having a compound fracture of their humerus, and my older son having appendicitis. I lived near the Pocono Mountains for a few months, specifically Indian Mountain Lake. There were multiple nights of waking up to screeching so loud you felt yourself vibrate, windows or doors being tapped, my car being banged on for hours. I had a 150-pound huge German Shepherd. He would chase everything, even bears off the property as routine at night. Some nights, though, he would refuse and just cry. One night, I had my friend over, we were high and I told him I was going to the bathroom upstairs. I heard him get up and open the blinds in front of the patio door. I automatically yelled at him upstairs and run down. He turns and says he swears he heard me outside calling for him and thought I took the dog out. I can't help but believe the mountains have very scary things that you don't question happen. I will never even visit there. My boyfriend, that I lived with at the time, had grown up in a cult. He had defected and all the things, but he had more residual stuff than he was telling me. One night I get home from work and he tells me there is evil in our house and we have to leave with the dogs now. His emotional state was unhinged. I got so worried on multiple levels and I wouldn't let him drive, so I did. He said we were going to his sister's and then a friend's. He ends up directing me to drive to these old hiking/biking/BMX trails behind a closed fast food chain restaurant. He adamantly wants me to get out with him to go down the trails. I say absolutely not. He starts praying and speaking in tongues and talking about a demon in our house. I cried and tried to talk him down. It took hours and when we got back, I knew our relationship could never recover and I made moves to leave everything I had made for myself during that relationship. I left. Me and my dog couch surfed at my friend's house and her stepmom's house for a few weeks before I could figure out what to do. In that moment, I knew if I got out of that car I would end up dead on some random trail in CA and my family would not know what happened to me. My survival instinct had never been so strong. I have never been so scared in my life. I took a date to the bird sanctuary. I'd been there a few times before and it was fun seeing various species of birds and feeding them seed. We saw signs warning us that it was egg-laying season. Okay, fair enough. I had never been near animals during mating season before and I'll make sure to never do that again. It was quite an experience. The birds were a lot more aggressive and territorial this time around. Some Canadian geese actually mugged us for seed. That was off-putting, but they left us be after they got what they wanted. But when we got to nearly the exit I remember being a little distracted by something. My girlfriend and me turned around after we lost interest and there was a crane right behind us. This thing was huge. I know that it could have hurt us badly with its beak or claws. I'm 5 feet 10 inches, not that tall but not short either. It towered over me and it didn't look friendly. We probably got too close to its eggs without noticing. My girlfriend was less panicky than me, so with her direction we backed away slowly and were making good progress when the crane took offense to another couple who panicked and ran. The bird didn't care for that and focused on them. We were close to the exit at that point, so managed to leave without further incident. But yeah, I got a healthy dose of respect for wild animals that day, being directly under an F3 tornado. Tornado ripped through my college campus at 4 a.m. I got blown out onto the balcony, looked up, there it was in all its glory, illuminated by almost constant lightning. Tore up most of the campus and all of downtown, and we all got sent home for a week or two, almost 25 years ago. Memories not perfect, while they cleared enough debris for it to not be wildly hazardous. Thankfully no deaths or mortal injuries. My dad and I drove to his hometown in Mexico a few years back. We knew not to drive at night BC of the cartel situation, so we timed the trip to have us arrive no later than 5 p.m. The problem was, this time, the border crossing took us hours compared to the 30 minutes max we've experienced before. My anxiety was at its limit, with knots in my stomach, thinking about the worst possible scenarios from the moment we reached the border, and every hour that passed without us crossing made me nauseous. Now we're 10 hours away, putting us at an 11 p.m. arrival, meaning we would be driving about 3 or so hours in the dark. If that wasn't enough, our GPS decided not to work in Mexican territory. Luckily for us, we'd made this trek enough times in my youth, when it was so much safer, and even fun, that my dad knew the cities we had to go by, so we would just follow the signs. Guess whose job it was to navigate? Don't get me wrong, I'm a great navigator by any means necessary, so it wasn't hard. But knowing that our lives were literally in my hands was absolutely terrifying. One wrong turn wouldn't be just an oopsie turnaround moment. I'm very glad to say that we had no missed turns or wrong exits or anything. What did happen, though, once we entered the city that bordered our town, was that the points, cartel lookouts, started following us and taking down our plates, radioing each other to watch for us and figure out where we were going. One of them even tried to get us to stop, but that's the last thing you should do. Our family told us later that there was a curfew in place, so no one was supposed to be out past sundown. They saw that we stopped at my grandma's and watched us until she let us in. We were safe once they found out who we were. A few other scary things happened in the 3 weeks we were there, but nothing was as terrifying as that drive. A few years back, I was getting ready for work and heard a scream from my 3-year-old daughter's room. As I'm sure most of you are aware, toddlers are noisy little buggers. When you have one, you develop an ear for their various screams, and this one was the "I'm really hurt" scream. I ran into her room and found my daughter just soaked in blood. It was everywhere. Her hair and face were covered in it, it was dripping down onto her shirt, it was all over her bed. There was so much blood I was sure she was dying. It was horrifying. I pulled myself together and managed to piece together what happened. She was jumping on the bed, fell, and hit her head on the headboard. She had about a 3-inch gash in her scalp, which is where the blood was coming from. I had no intellectually that head wounds bleed a lot, but seeing it in person was something else. We got her in the car and rushed to the ER, and they got her all fixed up. At the end of the day, it was just a scalp laceration and she needed staples to close it. No concussion or anything else more serious. But it scared the hell out of me. So I was a kid during this one time, sitting at the back of our car while my parents are driving along a highway at night. A motorcycle on our left was hand signaling my mom, driver, that he will overtake us. My mom slowed down a bit to 5-way. When the motorcycle guy was in front of us, he turned right a little too much out of lane, and got sideswiped by a speeding bus, on the right lane. He fell down. My mom swerved on the left a bit to dodge him, and my dad was cursing really bad because he saw the guy went under the bus, his head rolled over by the wheels. No helmet would save you from that. I didn't actually see it happen, but boy was I scared of my parents' reaction during that time. I was doing a tuk-tuk rally through India with my husband, and we were driving a particularly long stage of the rally and had been diverted due to flooding. We found ourselves in an enormous tailback going up a mountain that we needed to cross. As we were in a tuk-tuk, which are really small compared to a normal car, we bypassed most of the traffic until we found ourselves completely at a standstill somewhere near the top of the mountain. I get out to find out what is going on and how long we will have to wait, and find out there has been a massive landslide that has thrown a bus full of people off the mountain, and there is a search for survivors. I then realize what a precarious situation we're all in, hundreds and hundreds of cars up a mountain in the dark and rain with the mountainside unstable. I tell my husband it would be better if we turned round and went back, but then news starts to circulate that there has been another landslide behind us further down the mountain, and we are now trapped up the mountain until help arrives. We were stuck up there for about 8 hours, knowing that the mountainside could collapse at any moment, and I was so scared that I actually began to wildly hallucinate. We met up with other tuk-tuk drivers, and they had managed to make a small pathway through the landslide up ahead. Everyone on the bus died, big enough for tuk-tuks, so they were letting some of us through. But when we got through to the other side, it was total gridlock there too, with hundreds of cars blocking the route down even for tuk-tuks, but there was a large locked gate which some emergency officials were unlocking and needing the tuk-tuks through. We had no GPS signal but could see the road brightest to our destination in a very roundabout way, but it would work. So off we set in our open-sided tuk-tuks at about 2 a.m. all in the pouring rain. We ran out of gas at one point and had to wait for another tuk-tuk to come along to donate some to us, enough so we could reach a gas station. After 2 hours of slogging down the mountain, we eventually reached the highway, and an hour or two later the hotel we were booked into. When we told the rally staff what had happened and that there were still tuk-tuks from the rally up on the mountain, they literally went white. We had been diverted through a tiger reserve. I felt confident swimming in a pre-storm surf because I've done it multiple times in Florida. The difference was that in Cancun, they don't have the same barrier breaks, and the current was much stronger. The riptides pull you out much, much farther. I was pulled on a rip off of Cancun, and the waves were at least 2 to 3 times higher and faster than Florida. I could barely keep up for breath until the lifeguard saved me. We were spearfishing about 8 miles offshore and my buddy calls out to me, "White shark over here, only an 8 to 10 footer, but keep an eye out." I swim over to him and the other diver so we can watch each other's backs. Once I reach them, I look over my shoulder on instinct and I see the tail and back end of this thing swimming away from me. It had swam right up behind me and turned away. It was only about 10 feet long, but it was thick, twice as massive as the sand tigers we usually see when diving. It kept coming in close to check us out, so we got out and drove another 8 miles or so further out to a different spot. We all roll out the boat together, and as soon as the bubbles cleared, the first thing I see is another great white less than 20 feet from the boat. This one was about 15 feet long and bigger around than a 50-gallon drum. Giving birth. I had partial placenta previa, which means the placenta covers the cervix and is low in the uterus. It's usually much higher in the uterus. I also had a breech baby, which means their feet were at the bottom. Usually, it's the head. So I had to have a C-section. Usually, the doctor makes an incision, reaches in, grabs the head, and pulls it out. In my case, the doctor had to cut through the placenta, which is all capillaries, so he had to be quick in grabbing my baby. The head wasn't there, so he couldn't find my baby. In the meantime, I was bleeding profusely. I started to feel horrible. I was losing so much blood. My heart started hurting, and it was hard to breathe. Thankfully, they had put in a port for a spinal. They activated the spinal tap. All feeling below my waist was gone. I was still bleeding heavily. They made the incision bigger and fished around for my baby. Finally, he grabbed it and whisked my husband and the baby away. I never saw my baby. They had to quickly remove the placenta to stop the bleeding. My chest was really hurting and my heart rate was all messed up. I had to be defibrillated twice to get the heart rate regulated. That worked, and then I needed fluids and 4 units of blood. I had 2 IVs on each arm. I spent the day in ICU. The anesthesiologist stayed with me for hours. My husband bounced between me and the baby. I finally got to go to see my baby at 3 p.m. I delivered at 7:20 a.m. She was perfect. I was at summer camp and me and some friends took a canoe out on the water at night when weren't allowed to. We hit some rocks and flipped the canoe, and I went into the water. I'm a good swimmer, but the lake was full of weeds and algae and things like that, and I got tangled up in a lot of it and couldn't tread water. I came horrifyingly close to drowning, but my friend Mats dragged me to the surface again. I was underwater for only a minute or two splashing around and such, but it felt like it went on for half an hour. This is a series of things. In my 3rd year of college, I got this huge nosebleed. Not a big deal. I had a lot of nosebleeds as a kid, although I hadn't had a huge one in a few years. 2 days later, another huge nosebleed. Still not super weird. Sometimes after one big nosebleed, the blood clot can get dislodged and it starts another, usually smaller nosebleed. The next day, another huge nosebleed. Left a trail while I was running to get a tissue. That evening, another nosebleed. I basically averaged 1 nosebleed every day and a half for like 3 weeks at the end of the quarter. That was unusual. I was seriously starting to wonder if I had cancer or some kind of blood disease. But, no health insurance. It stopped happening during winter break, so I was like, okay, whatever, it was just some weird thing. About 3 weeks into winter quarter, once again, huge nosebleed. And it kept happening. Nosebleed after nosebleed. And like, when I say huge, I mean if I stuck a tampon up my nose it would have been soaked through within a minute. It was awful. I quite genuinely thought I might actually be dying. It was a really scary time. In happy news, I figured out that I'm allergic to chili pepper and that was causing my nosebleeds. I stopped having it on my fries every day for lunch and dinner and the nosebleeds stopped immediately. Made sense, I wasn't having it for lunch and dinner during the 6-week winter break, so the nosebleeds stopped then, but then picked back up a little while after the quarter started. So, yeah. Chili powder gives me gushing nosebleeds and it turns out I wasn't actually dying after all, hooray. Actually, Ike, about the hooray part, I got a few scary stories, but this one popped into my head first. One night I was waiting for the bus after work, was about midnight when a gang of indigenous guys showed up. They were obviously drunk or high, and chatting amongst themselves when suddenly one called over to me, "Isn't that right, white boy?" I turned and asked what he meant, and he asked me something along the lines of, "What do you think of native people?" I was sure I was going to get jumped at this point, but I remained calm and simply said, "Same as anyone else, we are all human." And the biggest guy said, "No, not me, I'm not human." And I quickly replied, "Well, I guess you must be superhuman then." That made them all laugh and seemed to gain their respect. They left me alone after that. My heart was beating a million times a minute though. I was roughly 12 years old. My dad was out of town, I was the man of the house. Middle of the night, mom and little brother sleeping upstairs, me downstairs, bedroom near the front entrance. I wake up to noise outside. Someone loudly hammering on our front steps handrail. Then I hear running and bam. A loud thud against our front door. Sound of footsteps walking away, then running and crashing into the door again. I don't know my thought process, but I didn't want to wake up my mom or brother. I didn't call the cops. I just grabbed a bat, sat facing the front door and listened to whoever was there crashing against it for around 30 minutes. I figured if he broke through, he would be staggered, so I would just start hitting him as hard as I could. Eventually whoever it was just left and it never happened again. I never told my mom. I didn't want to worry her. Having my wisdom tooth out. I know what you're thinking, that's not scary, but hear me out. I've been through the worst experiences that most people can go through, including having a parent die when I was a child, being horribly neglected and abused through childhood, being homeless. But nothing compares to the experience I had with my wisdom tooth. My wisdom tooth was infected. Extremely painful, and in my country it is not easy to find a dentist. I went to NHS dentist who put me on 2 types of antibiotics for a week. These made me horribly sick. I couldn't eat, drink or hold anything down for 8 days, so after those course of antibiotics I went back to the same dentist. He told me that the tooth needed to come out. I was terrified, of course. He told me there was a 90% chance he could get it out that day, but with no painkillers or sedation. No, thanks. Bear in mind my jaw had seized up to the point where I could not open my mouth wide enough for the dentist to put his pinky between my teeth. He told me I would need to seek private care. I called a private dentist as soon as I got home and got an emergency appointment for the next day. At this dentist they sprayed my jaw and gave me another course of the same antibiotics that hadn't worked beforehand and told me to come back in 16 days. I prepared to go back to work, but as soon as I started taking these antibiotics again, the pain got unbearable, to the point where I spent all day basically sobbing into my pillow because it was so bad. I couldn't go on like this. I hadn't eaten anything at all in nearly 2 weeks and I was overdosing on painkillers in order to feel somewhat comfortable. After a call to our non-emergency health line in my country, in which I was hysterically crying because I was losing my marbles at this point and becoming suicidal that I couldn't find help quick enough, I was sent to a dental hospital. Finally, at this point I was seriously ill and was throwing up in waiting rooms, having to stop taxis at the side of the road to throw up, and I even threw up while the dental hospital examined me. They pretty much took one look at me and told me to go straight to A&E. They paid for a taxi to take me there. Once at A&E I sat in the waiting room for maybe an hour and 30 minutes, sat on my own, throwing up in a corner at the back of the room. Once I was taken through they gave me a COVID test. This happened March 2022, so COVID was still a thing, and tested positive. I was so ill that they asked me if I knew I had COVID, and of course I didn't. I got sat in a room on my own for up to 8 hours with nurses coming in maybe every hour or so to check on me or hook me up to 4 fluid or tell me what's happening. I eventually went for a CT scan to see how badly I needed an operation. After that a nurse came in less than half an hour later to tell me they need to operate immediately and I may be placed on an ICU unit. None of this registered at the time as I was so scared and sick I was barely even there mentally. They took me away to have my operation and I woke up 2 hours later to a nurse stroking my hair and a gaping hole in my neck with drains in. I had to stay in hospital for 3 days and were probably the worst out of the whole experience. Having nurses coming in 3 times a day to hook more 4 antibiotics into me. At one point the cannula came loose on my arm and had to be put back in. The nurse tried to put it in my hand. It was in the crease of my elbow before, and tried to put fluid through it and it just gathered like some bubble in my hand. During this time I was on very bad terms with my flatmate and also kicked her out while I was laying in my hospital bed. I had some time to ponder on what happened afterwards and I realized that due to how urgently they wanted to operate, talking about putting me in intensive care, how much pain I was in and how out of it I was at the time, if I hadn't gone to hospital that day I probably wouldn't be here to tell the tale. I now have a tattoo of a wisdom tooth and a scar on my neck to remind me of how I got through the single scariest thing I've ever been through in my life. Driving down a divided highway late at night in the northbound lanes. I'm in the passing lane. I've driven or ridden down this road easily thousands of times. There is a bend in the road and I see headlights coming around. Not unusual, but something feels wrong about the lights. Check mirrors to get over, look back and headlights are shining in my face. Jump 2 lanes to the shoulder and barely miss a massive pickup going the wrong way. This is when I learned that you should never cruise in the passing lane at night because that's the lane drunk drivers are in when they go the wrong way. When I was like 13 years old, me and my best friend went from my house to a nearby mall walking. My mom wouldn't let me go out alone since I live in a third world country and it's not very safe, even in the rich neighborhoods. Anyway, we kinda escaped to the mall, And when we were coming back, it was already a bit dark, and a random guy approached us asking us if we knew how to get to a nearby hospital. We actually believed him and tried to help. Then he pulled out a gun and told us to walk with him to the park without making noise. The park nearby was pretty big and almost empty. He made us sit with him and put our cell phone/wallet in the center and told us to close our eyes for like 15 minutes and said that he had a car nearby with another guy prepared to kidnap us if we opened them or tried to escape. Well, we stayed there like 20 minutes, eyes closed and terrified. It was already dark by then. We heard him walking away and a car engine sound. Then after waiting a while, we saw he was gone and literally went running back to my place. I guess being manipulated like that and not knowing what could happen makes it scary. I don't know if it's the scariest thing that happened to me, but it's an experience I won't forget. Lived in Washington State. I was going to Arizona for college by myself, and I was driving home to college not realizing it, and I was being followed by a car for hours. I was alone, only 20 years old, and had no idea why a car was following me. Then all of a sudden a cop showed up. The car following me left and the cop pulled me over, telling me that it was blood week and they were following you until you stopped, so their new recruits will attempt to kill you to get into the gang. I was so traumatized I had to fly home. Stayed with my granddad once. He was pasty as bird shit and wore an equally white nightgown that sort of flowed. It was 2 in the morning and I opened the door to go to the bathroom across the hall from my room, where he had kept this antique heater from the 40s at, and it had a red glow, but other than that there was no light. Upon opening the door, my grandfather zoomed past without making any sound whatsoever and headed into the rest of the house in complete darkness. Didn't turn on any lights. I shut my door and didn't open it until I saw daylight, thinking that he had died in his sleep and now roamed his house as a restless ghost. It terrified me to the point I couldn't sleep in the dark well into my late teens. I was riding my bike home from work and felt like I was being followed by a van. He drove much slower than the speed limit and stayed behind me. It was a busy street in broad daylight, so I didn't make too much of it. The van suddenly accelerated, passed me by, drove onto the sidewalk and abruptly stopped, blocking my path. The driver jumped out and ran to the back doors of the van. I immediately took a turn to a small street left of me and saw him run around the van and jump back into the driver's seat across my shoulder. He backed up and followed me. I biked for my life and he eventually gave up and drove away. The street was a dead end except for bikers and walkers. I knew because this happened a few 100 meters from my home. I'm pretty sure I was about to be kidnapped. I still get creeped out thinking about it and regret not remembering the license plate. Had a stalker that followed me around for a few years and in different provinces. Was working as a hairdresser, and he was a bit too interested in me, gay male. At first, I politely declined any advances. Soon, I caught a strange truck semi-often following me from work every now and again. A few months go by and eventually find out he's a businessman from a few towns over who is married to a woman with 2 kids. Police refuse to intervene. Skip ahead a few months, and we move 2 provinces over about 12 hours away. He finds me there as well. Police still refuse to help, so I looked him up in the computer we use form work. Turns out he was dumb enough to give me his actual house phone hash, not like a personal cell. We took deets for haircuts, called from a payphone and spoke to his wife. Never saw him again after that. Was driving along in my town, doing about 50 kilometers per hour, started to slow so I could then into another street, so was about 30 kilometers per hour, when my diff snapped and my back wheels locked up and I came to a very loud screeching halt. The car was fishtailing. It was days before Christmas last year. The part that made it more scary is I had actually made a doctor's appointment, and my doctor is in another town, so driving there I would have been doing 100 kilometers per hour, and a lot of big semi-trucks and B-doubles drive that highway, as well as fully loaded coal trucks, who often like to tailgate you till there is a spot they can overtake. The reality set in when I was talking to the tow truck driver about that, and he said, yeah, if you had a truck up your arse, it would have cleaned you up, as they would not be able to stop or avoid you in time. I have 4 kids. We would have all been killed. I got panic attacks every time after that, when in taxis or other people's cars. My car has since been fixed, but I still panic. I have an out-of-town trip to do next week that is an hour each way, and I'm so scared of something like that happening again. And I'm still not great driving around, so limited to essentials only. I went to college in Portland, Oregon, where Teresa big homeless/drug problem. One of the meth people got this delusion that our house belonged to him. He truly believed he lived there. He kept coming back, at one point entering one of my roommates' room while they were in there. It went on for a week, the hostility increasing. Eventually we were able to get him arrested, but he was released very quickly and we were not warned. It's like 3 a.m. I'm hanging out watching a horror movie with the girl I'm seeing. I live in the basement and we hear footsteps above us. There's 5 of us in the house and we all have weird sleep schedules, so this was normal. But the footsteps keep going. Eventually I hear the door to my room creak open. Now I start panicking because I know none of my roommates would just walk into my room, let alone at 3 a.m. Then we heard him start to walk down the stairs. My bed/TV are almost directly under the stairs, so we hear every step loudly, and just sort of freeze. Then I snap out of it and run at him in my underwear brandishing a kendo sword. He runs away, but this fucker has already stolen my new laptop. I ended up staying awake the rest of the night cause I had a feeling he would come back, and sure enough he had hidden some of our stuff behind the trash and came back to get it at sunrise. I chased him down in the middle of the road, took everything he was carrying back, but my laptop was long gone. I thought one of my roommates was a total prick, so I did not get his guitar back for him. Was home alone, was looking out the window, saw a man walking his dog, was texted and was asked to get post. I open door but I see the man and dog's shadow coming toward me, so I shut the door and run to the kitchen. In the kitchen I stare at the door and I can see a black silhouette. Usually you can see color of the person's clothes through the frosted glass, but all I saw was black, and the figure didn't knock, he just stood there. So I turned my head and looked back to the door and the black silhouette had gone. I run back from the living room and looked back out the window and the dog and man was gone too. I don't know what that was about. I've always been a very anxious person with an avoidant personality, and have suffered from anxiety attacks as long as I could remember. When I was younger, I classified them as panic attacks. A few years ago, I was a daily weed smoker. It would initially make my anxiety worse but eventually calm me down. One day, I took a giant bong rip and started coughing harder than I ever have. I started thinking I was having a heart attack, my chest hurt and I couldn't breathe. I was home alone, and just laid down on the couch trying desperately to catch my breath, contemplating if I should call 911. My brain literally told me I was dying. But I also knew I might be freaking out. Eventually I calmed down, but over the next 2 weeks, I consistently had major panic attacks and kept having to call out of work, which was especially frowned upon because I was a manager. So I forced myself into work one of the days, panicking on the way there the whole time. I walked in the front door and felt like I was going to black out. I left without saying anything and then drove to see my ex and told her I just wanted to see her one more time because I was afraid I was going to die soon. She took me to the ER, and they told me there was nothing wrong with my heart and I was just having panic attacks. They didn't really do much else for me other than to tell me to take a cold shower and practice breathing exercises. I felt like I was dying multiple times per day for hours at a time for 2 weeks. I eventually got put on Xanax, antidepressants and see a therapist bi-weekly. It's a weak story compared to a lot of others here, but feeling like death is imminent every day for 2 weeks was pretty fucking intense. Wouldn't wish it on anyone. When I was 18, I was parked in front of my friend's house waiting for him to get home. Late one night, I saw a guy in my rearview mirror walking on the sidewalk towards my direction. Next thing I knew, there was a shotgun barrel pointed at my head. He had shoved it through the partially open window on the passenger side and aimed it right at me. I panicked and quickly started my car and sped off. I could hear the gun as it got caught briefly in the window. I went to the nearest coffee shop and called the police, but I don't recall whether or not they ever found him. I had men try to kidnap me twice growing up so they could sell me into the sex trade. When I was 13, my mom was talking to a guy named Rick from our church to hopefully sell her some weight loss shakes. I never met Rick, but he was talked about in the house for weeks. One day, I go outside and walk my dogs. I have a routine of times when I walk the dogs, and just as I walked outside I see 2 men in a white pickup truck. One had a shaved head and killer stare. He stayed in the truck with the ignition running, unwilling to break eye contact. The other was Rick, who mentioned my mom's name, and he came a bit early to show her the weight loss shakes. Rick was wearing a fake wig sports fans wear with faux gel spiked hair and the team's logo on the hat. Rick asked if I could help him with bringing in the shakes into the house. I had a sinking feeling something wasn't right and I said no thanks. Rick inches closer to me and my dog lunges at Rick and begins growling at him. I leave and just feel scared because it was such a weird experience. 2 months later, I met the real Rick. The real Rick was in his 50s, the fake Rick and his friend were in their mid-30s. I tell my mom about the incident, but unfortunately she suffers from severe mental health issues. Anything traumatic I tell her or she experiences, she develops amnesia. I had no friends, was bullied a lot, and abused at home constantly. I would mention to my mom many times about the attempted kidnapping and she would forget. It made me doubt myself if it ever truly happened. Was I that forgettable and unlovable for someone not to care to remember my life-altering trauma? About 1.5 years goes by and now I'm 15 years old when the kidnappers try to get me again. This time they were not so gentle in their attempt. I get a phone call on the home phone when a man's voice asks me, "Is Mary home?" Mary is the fake name for my mom to protect her identity. I reply to the man, "Yes, but she's in the shower." I lied since I was truly home alone with my younger sister and I. The man on the phone said, "No, she isn't. She's at work, you're home alone. I know your homeroom teacher, school bus, your address. I'm coming for you. This group of men were stalking me outside my house for months, listening to every conversation I had to get intel so they could use that against me. I cry out of fear and hang up the phone calling 911. I was so lucky the cops showed up when they did. The female officer and I were talking at the front door when I see this car flooring the gas pedal trying to get to my house. I lived in a cul-de-sac at the time. As soon as he saw the cops, the man did a quick turnaround in the cul-de-sac, fearing for his safety. The cop asked me if I knew that car. I lied out of fear that he would come back again if they pursued him without seeing his license plate number well. I said yes. The cop asked me if I was sure and I said yes. To this day, it's my biggest regret. I was too scared to tell the truth, and I don't know how many young women and girls were kidnapped and sold into sexual slavery because I didn't speak up. The men never tried for a third time, thankfully. After those events, I realized they would watch me go from the shower to my bedroom. There was a small window that gave them a glimpse of me in a towel running to the bedroom for my clothes. I remember that pickup truck a few times parked on the street in front of the house on the street. I thought it was my neighbor's company parking there, so I didn't think much about it. In reality, it was a group of men who got sick thrills looking at a child flee from the bathroom to the bedroom in a towel. Honestly, it happened today. I went to get the basketball next door, and the neighbor's dog chased at me and I yelled, "Hey!" And the dog suddenly stopped and ran back and then started licking its paws like nothing happened. My heart continued beating rapidly for the next 6 or 7 minutes. It really sucked. Glad I have a way with dogs when it comes to using my voice, or else my face would have been ripped off in less than 2 seconds. I was 17 at a bar in Bali with my father and his best mate. I had a few beers, and the waitress asked if I wanted to play pool upstairs. I said sure, I love pool. Went up there, and there were 7 local dudes playing in dim lighting, all tatted up with gang tattoos and smoking cigars. I made sure to place my beer far from theirs in case they wanted to spike it. I waited my turn, and as I was playing, they all surrounded me and went to grab what I assumed was knives out of their pocket. As they got around me, my father must have got father's intuition and came up the stairs and announced he was my dad and wanted to play as well. They all sat back down and chatted in their language. Found out a couple of days later that the waitress saw I was a tipsy and young and sent me up there to get stabbed and robbed, and my dad saved me by just coming up to check on me. One time when I was around 11 years old, I was walking to school as usual. It was still dark and nobody was outside. Me and a friend always met up at her house, which was on the way to the train station, but the 5 minutes it took me to get there, I was alone. I wasn't far from her place, when a man started walking towards me. I immediately got scared and took out my phone to pretend I was talking to someone. He passed me and in relief I ended the call. But the second I put my phone away, he asked me for my name. I froze and told him. He came up to me and I could tell he was very drunk. He asked if he could walk with me. I said yes. He put his arm around me and as we started walking, I told him I needed to turn right because my friend was waiting for me. That was when he let go of me, said goodbye, and began walking in the direction he'd come from. I kept walking towards my friend's house, when he started shouting "I love you" from the other side of the street and then walked away. I was so relieved when my friend finally came out of her house. I don't know if anything would have happened to me if I hadn't mentioned meeting my friend. I saw him again years later, when I was on my way to the hairdresser with my mother. He was pushing a bike on the exact same street I'd previously encountered him. He unsurprisingly didn't seem to recognize me. Never saw him again after that.